Hello everyone. This is Al Fadi, and I'd like to welcome you to a new video series that we are going to call The Sonship of Christ. And it will be a teaching that will be done by our dear brother Anthony Rogers, whom we have really the honor of having him here virtually, joining us shortly. And obviously, the topic of the Sonship of Christ is very powerful. But sometimes it can be confusing to some people, even to believers. For instance, as a former Muslim myself, Islam taught me that the fact that Jesus is being called the Son of God, somehow this means that God has a wife or has a concubine. In other words, he has to sleep with a woman, and the product of this is a son, and this son now somehow is Jesus. And to a Muslim, they look at that with really disgust, and they claim that this is blasphemy against God, which we agree if indeed that's what the Bible teaches concerning the sonship of Christ. But it's lack of understanding, obviously, about the nature of Christ, the doctrine of the Trinity, the person of the Son of God, and so on and so forth. To Christians, I noticed when I was seeking that they didn't really know how to even articulate that. I'm not saying every single one of them, but at least in general, you feel like there is a level of lack of understanding, or maybe weakness in discipleship, or it could be other misunderstandings of how to articulate such an important notion. There is a book, by the way, called The Sonship of Christ by Ty Gibson, exploring the covenant identity of God and man. And here is what he says. I like this quotation. He says, when we read the Bible as an unfolding narrative, as the big story it actually is, with key characters played out in an overarching intentional plot line, the meaning of the sonship of Christ becomes unmistakably evident. And I like this because really, to understand the sonship of Christ, you have to do a survey, oftentimes, and go through the Bible cover to cover. Although, given that this series is going to be brief in its nature, we are going to give you a flavor of such survey. And with that in mind, I want to welcome our dear brother Anthony to the studios. Anthony, thank you so much, brother, for taking the time to be here with us.
Thank you, Al. It's great to be on with you again.
Thank you. So, brother, the sonship of Christ is obviously a very complex topic, but also is a very simple one if you really understand the context of the Bible. So why don't you give us a brief overview of the complexity of such topic and the simplicity of understanding it as well?
Yeah, well, what I want to do in particular here is underscore the importance of this. And it's clear as you look at the New Testament witness, and we'll probably have some occasion to point out its contact with the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, the sonship of Christ is thrown into the foreground. It's not an insignificant matter. In fact, when you look at the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's the very turning point or hinge of those Gospels. It focuses on Christ's sonship. Not that Christ's sonship isn't in view before or after that hinge, but the whole point is there comes a point in the synoptics, particularly Matthew 16, Mark 9, and Luke 8, where Jesus asks his disciples who they say that he is. And it gives you the distinct impression that everything leading up to that was designed to point them to this fact and enable them to answer it aright. And then it's only when they're able to rightly answer this question that Jesus then begins to talk to them about his mission, namely that he's going to go to the cross. And that already then shows you the significance of this idea of Christ's sonship. Now, when I refer to the incident here that I mentioned in Matthew 16, Mark 9, and so on, of course, I'm referring to the incident at Caesarea Philippi. There, Jesus says to the disciples, who do you say, who do the people say that I am? And then they give various answers. There's all these different answers being given. And then Jesus, as if sweeping those all aside, rejecting them all as inadequate, says, who do you say that I am?
Right.
And then Peter, speaking on behalf of the others, says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then, of course, it's right after that that Jesus tells Peter and the other disciples what he's going to do in Jerusalem. In other words, the death that he's going to die its efficacy, its value, its accomplishment depends upon this identification of him as the Son. It's precisely because he's the Son that his death is going to accomplish redemption. That's a stumbling block for the disciples, of course, at that point in the Gospels. But nevertheless, that's what the Gospel writers are pointing out. So you see here something of the importance of it. Another thing that shows us how important this is, and this also, I think, kind of brings us closer to addressing your question about its simplicity. In John's Gospel, because a moment ago I mentioned the synoptics and how it's important there, but John tells us in his thesis statement at the end of his Gospel that this is the very thing that he's driving at. This is the point that he's trying to get people to understand and get people to believe. At the end, he says, "Therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name."